It is, I think, a particular pleasure to be here in America at this great hour, when at last the grip of I think they're now called the fake media, has been broken, the mainstream media. They have now been defeated. And what they did, thank you so much, was vile. It was disgusting. And the people, in the end, didn't buy it. Because now, from conferences such as this, and via the magic of the internet, which was invented for us by Al Gore himself, we are now able to go to places where the false media, the fake media, can no longer go. And the truth is out there because we are putting it out there. So do not think that your attendance here has been wasted, for it has not. This is my title, The Monstrous Hoax, because Ed Griffin told me to. Now, I do think that before I say anything else, we should all stand and show in the traditional fashion our gratitude to the Griffins for having done this wonderful conference. Come along, ladies and gentlemen. Now, that slide actually is a picture of Phoenix, Arizona. It's a genuine picture. And this is what happens when Monckton comes to town. Now, global warming is real. Here is a brief history of it. And I'm very grateful to my old friend, Professor M.I. Bhatt of the Indian Geological Survey for having communicated to me this interesting result in climatological thermodynamics. And likewise, deforestation is a problem. So we are not saying that there is no such thing as climate change, and there's no such thing as environmental problems. Yes, there are, but they're not as serious as they're made out to be. The only problem you do have to watch out for is large falling objects. This is me, 10,000 feet above the Durban UN Climate Conference. They were very surprised when I touched down. And we are going to drop in on them again tonight, because I shall be announcing towards the end of this presentation an interesting scientific result that I and my team have come across, which brings the climate scare forever to an end. Now, Ed told me we needed to do something about the fraudulent aspects of climate change, and he said, would I please do that? So I said, yes, of course, I do everything Ed tells me. I'm very obedient. And it says here, red flags that point to fraud. And this was the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. And as you will see, for the first time since the fall of the Berlin Wall, communist flags were being openly paraded in the street, and at what event? At a UN-sponsored climate conference, which tells you all you need to know about the questionable politics of the United Nations. My modest proposal is that the United States and Britain should jointly leave the United Nations and when the United States has asked the United Nations to pick up its bags and go, there is a very nice riverside property that should be converted into expensive apartments and bags eye the penthouse. So, global CO2 emissions are above all predictions. You will have heard them saying, well, we're really making progress, and the reason why temperature hasn't been rising as fast as we thought is that we've got CO2 under control. No, we haven't. It is rising at a rate above the top end or business as usual case in the IPCC's 1990 first assessment report. This is because of China, which for all its posturing about how terrible climate change is in fact making a fortune out of selling windmills and solar panels to us while building sensible coal-fired power stations itself. But measured warming is well below all predictions. So CO2 running above what they predicted, but measured warming below. And I updated this graph yesterday to take into account the latest data from all the 5 major data sets. And you will see there in a rather lurid pink the lurid predictions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and below, in blue there, what happened. The 3 sort of bluish and purplish lines are the 3 terrestrial data sets. The 2 green ones show a slightly different result. Even lower are the satellite data sets. And as you can see, at no point does any of their predictions, measurements, this is actual measurements, overlap with the predictions made by the IPCC in 1990. All of that range of predictions is way above what's actually happened. How many of you have seen that published in any of the so-called mainstream news media? I do not see any hands. Now, this is the very latest results from the 2 satellite data sets. I picked those up this afternoon, and they again show the 2 satellite data sets well below the lowest prediction of the IPCC in 1990. And you may remember the pause that carried on until about November last year, and this graph was actually displayed by Ted Cruz at a hearing in the Senate, to the great discomfiture of the so-called Democrats, because they had no means of explaining it, and they flanneled around and faffed around and behaved badly, but they couldn't land a blow on him. This is not what was predicted. The rate of global warming should be fairly steadily accelerating. Yes, you'll get ups and downs. What you didn't expect and nobody predicted was very nearly 20 years now without any significant global warming. But they don't like to admit that pause existed, except to deny it. Here is a dreadful little man called Thomas Carl, who was until recently the head of the Notional Atmospheric and whatever they call themselves, administration. Oceanographic, that was the other one. And he wrote this, well, that they've looked at it and they don't think that the temperature records are getting it right. They know better. Well, what they did was to fudge the record. You see, the surface temperatures of the ocean are measured by the Argo bathythermographs, and he didn't know this, and they show no increase in global temperatures over the entire 12 years of the record. And then there are the satellite data for just above the surface, which show no global warming for those 18 years and 9 months. And somehow Tom Carl was saying that between the surface of the ocean and the lower troposphere immediately above it, somehow there was an enormous amount of warming, even though neither the surface nor the troposphere above it was warming. That is how dim it is. And any halfway competent journalist would have noticed that and would have said, oh, come off it. And Tom Carl would have been hounded out of office, accompanied by gales of laughter. But no. And here is James Hansen, one of the earliest predictions of global warming. Between the 2 vertical lines there, that's the observations so far, projecting those trends out, as you can see, well below all the predictions he then made. The models have failed and failed and failed again. Here is Hansen again in 1988 before Congress. The black line this time is the measurement, and you can see that his predictions, which are the red arrow, much, much higher up. Once again, completely wrong. Here are 33 models of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the CMIP-5 models as they're called, and the global temperature is the black line jiggling up and down, and the more you come towards me, the more departure there is between that and the much higher predictions they were making. Here is, I think, 73 models, all of which, every single one of which, predicted more global warming in the crucial tropical mid-troposphere than is observed by either the satellites or by the dropsondes or by the radiosondes. All these 3 methods of measurement, not one of those methods of measurement bears out any of the model's predictions. All of them were exaggerated. Here is our very own Wet Office, which has been dismal. They keep forecasting barbecue summers. So if you ever have a barbecue summer, do invite me to come, because we never get them in the UK. And their predictions are wrong. Here is the IPCC itself. This is a huge enlargement of a postage stamp-sized corner of one of the graphs in the 2013 assessment report. And as you can see, if you blow it up so that you can actually see it, which you can't as it's printed, you can see that they have realized that their predictions in red and in blue are well above the observations, which are in black, for global temperatures over the last 8 or 9 years. Here is their attempt to predict methane concentration. The black line and arrow right along the bottom are what's actually observed, and each of the 4 assessment reports wildly, wildly exaggerated. And you've now got in California, Flaco Governor Jerry Brown, in his campaign against farmers because they vote Republican. He has not only driven them off the whole of central California by turning off their water and pouring it into the sea because he thinks the ocean needs to be topped up, but he's also now planning to do the same in Northern California. And he has just today signed into law a provision, an act, that requires farmers to record the amount of methane emitted by each of their cows and imposes restrictions upon them. So the farmers are now going to have to tell their cows, do not burp or fart so much. And here is yet another failed prediction of temperature from the IPCC, and so it goes on. But not only that, once they realized they'd got the temperature predictions wrong, they decided, let's bring up the observed temperatures until they match the predictions. And here's how they did it. This is thanks to Tony Heller, who writes as Stephen Goddard on his own very good website. You should go to that. It's very, very good on this temperature thing. This is the original data from the US Historical Climate Network of stations around the United States. And what it shows, embarrassingly for the official theory, is a decline in temperatures over the 20th century. But not to worry, what we can do is adjust the data. And this is what they publish. Quite astonishing, isn't it? From that to that, from that to that. And that's a red flag when they have to tamper with the data. That indicates things are going wrong. Here is NASA GISS playing the same game. That to that, from that to that. And you can see that in the 1930s, that's what it was actually like. And they've depressed the 1930s value and increased the value at the right-hand end of the graph, which is where we are, so as to make it look as though the rate of global warming in the 20th century was considerably greater than it actually was. That's the effect of these changes. And no doubt they will have some mimbling pseudo-scientific pretext for doing this, but it doesn't look very good that very nearly all of such warming as has been observed since 1950 depends on adjustments like these. Take away the adjustments, and there really hasn't been much in the way of warming. Here you see the same thing going on down under in Australia. This is picked up by Joe Daleo. The same thing also in New Zealand, which led to a famous court case, to the huge embarrassment of the New Zealand Bureau of Meteorology. They're all doing it. And here's an interesting observation. The record temperatures were much more frequently observed in the 1930s in the United States than they were at any time since. But you don't see that reported in any of the mainstream news media. Extreme weather predictions have been extremely exaggerated. Let's get on to a few of these. Here, for instance, are 50 million climate refugees by 2010, said the UN with the usual extraordinary self-confidence. Am I right that it's now 2016? But not to worry, along comes a French professor and says, oh, well, bad luck, that didn't quite work out. But there are going to be 20 million climate refugees by 2020. Well, I don't often make predictions, but I'm going to make one now. There won't be 50 million climate refugees by 2020 or anything like it. And here is a very interesting one, which nobody else had done it, so I did it. I downloaded the entire Argo bathythermograph dataset for the first 11 years of its existence. I haven't yet succeeded in downloading last year's data, but this is as far as I could get. And what it shows is the ocean is warming. However, it's warming, though this graph doesn't show this, it's warming from below. the surface layer of the ocean isn't really warming. And then as you go deeper, down to the 1.25 mile depth that these automated buoys go, taking the temperature and salinity profiles as they come back up, it's from below that the warming is happening. And if it were warming by us in the atmosphere transferred to the ocean, then it would be from above. The profile would be completely the other way about. And what that suggests is that something's going on at the bottom of the ocean that we're not monitoring, but somehow heat is coming up from there. And it's that, perhaps, which is the cause of it, no small fraction of the global warming we're experiencing. We don't know. But what we do know is this, that if you take that top 1.25 mile slab of the ocean as a whole, and you take the whole Argo data set for its first 11 years, the rate at which the planet is warming is equivalent to, wait for it, 1 Celsius every 430 years. That's the data, but you won't have seen that reported in any mainstream news media. And of course, because the ocean isn't warming much, sea level isn't rising much. And so what have they done? They've adjusted the data. The true data, the measured data, are the green line there between 2003 and 2008. The reason why it's at that period is that the paper revealing this was published by Kazanav et al. In 2009, and you'll see the entirely fictional estimate of sea level rise that was invented because they weren't getting the rise that they wanted. So they said, well, but you see, the glaciers have come off the land, and so the land is rising, and that would give you an element of the sea level appearing to fall. And so if we correct for that, then we can see the true effect of man-made global warming, which is a sea level rise like the red line. But the truth is that the sea level actually fell from 2003 to 2008, but you won't have seen that reported in any mainstream news medium. Hurricanes, unchanged throughout the period of satellite observation. There's the record by Dr. Ryan Maui at Florida State University, and likewise the accumulated cyclone energy index, which is the energy from all hurricanes and tropical storms worldwide, and you'll see that it's practically at its lowest level at the moment in the whole of the satellite record. But this is what they print in the peer-reviewed journals. As you can see, this is Atlantic serious hurricanes between 1970 and that quite busy year of 2005, in which Katrina, among other things, appeared. And what you'll see is there is this terrifying increase at the end of that period, and this was ascribed in this paper, which was Webster et al. 2006, to global warming caused by us, until I came along and had a look at the earlier data, which they had somehow left out of the paper. That's what was published. That's what was true. Actually, less hurricane activity now than there was earlier. So they just left out the earlier data so you couldn't see that. And they based this entire paper on that fraud. And here is, you may have heard everybody going on about how we're going to get droughts. And yes, you've had a drought in parts of America over the last few years because of the warm blob, which I think was Al Gore going for a swim in the Pacific Ocean. And you have, in fact, the most detailed survey of the areas of the planet Earth, the land areas that are under drought conditions, was conducted by Howe et al., published in 2014, and it shows a decline, a downtrend in droughts throughout the last 30 years. That's what I would have expected, because if you warm the atmosphere, then it can, in theory, hold near exponentially more water vapor, and that will diminish the droughts. And indeed, there are nomadic tribes in the Sahara going back to regions they couldn't go back to before, because suddenly those regions are green again, and the plants are growing, and the oases have got water in them. So it's not all bad, but you never hear that in the mainstream media. Here is the terrifying increase in rainfall in the longest record that we have available, which is that of the Met Office. And it shows, for England and Wales, this is the longest record we have anywhere in the world, that we now have to experience in England a terrifying nearly 2 inches extra per year compared with a quarter of a millennium ago. That is how very stable our climate is, and that's an important point I'll come back to. Then we have no more Himalayan ice by 2025, That was 2035, I think it was. That was the IPCC in 2007. Their own expert reviewers told them not to say it, but they said it anyway. And for 6 months after the likes of me pointed out that that was pants, they went on saying it. And the railroad engineer Rajendra Pachauri, now facing trial for various sexually predatory offences, this is the sort of people they have on the IPCC, he went and said anybody who dares to challenge anything the IPCC says ought to be locked up because they must be wrong. The IPCC is right, it's perfect, I'm in charge, don't worry. Well, eventually it turned out that the paper they'd relied upon wasn't a paper, it was a news report from a communist activist journalist, and that is the kind of material they put in IPCC reports, as long as it says what the party line wants it to say. Here is Greenland, an interesting paper by the Danes who own Greenland. This is Ola Johannesson et al. In 2005, and what it shows that although there's been some loss of the coastal ice, probably because the ocean is a little bit warmer, and because of changes in winds and currents which happen on a cyclical basis, at above 1,500 meters, or 5,000 foot, which is where the vast majority of the high plateau of Greenland is, there is a steady accumulation of ice, and indeed in the study area that they examined, quite a large area of that plateau, they found that in the 12 years preceding the publication of this paper, the ice had thickened by snow piling on the top of it at a cumulative rate of 2 inches a year. So again, you don't see this reported anywhere. Here is global sea ice extent in blue and trend in red for the entire satellite record. Now, if you had a heartbeat as regular as that, you would be regarded as a very healthy little planet. And here is what has happened to the number of people who are being killed by this terrible decrease in decreased weather. Oh dear, it's fallen. It's worse than we thought. And then there are various other mistakes that their models have made. Here, for instance, is their prediction from the 2007 fourth assessment report of the existence of a hotspot. I had the honor to give this its name, the tropical mid-troposphere hotspot, where in these latitude versus altitude graphs, at a pressure altitude of about 300 hectopascals, which is around sort of 5 or 6 kilometers up in the atmosphere, you would expect, according to their theory, that if and only if we were the cause of the warming, that hotspot would appear, and it would dominate all other forcings, which wouldn't show that hotspot. That's what this graph is showing. It's originally from a politicized scientist called Ben Santer, who many of you will have heard of, and he's as wrong about this as he is about everything else, but that's what the IPCC predicted because it suited the party line. All the models predict the same thing. There are 4 completely different models compared with the ones we've just seen. They all predict the same thing. And here's the truth. Where that question mark is, that's where the hotspot should be, and these are the actual measured, observed realities. It isn't there. And what that means is that there isn't a water vapor feedback, which we'll see later. And here, remember they had that great campaign against chlorofluorocarbons because it was damaging the ozone hole. And now these ozone depleters, the chlorofluorocarbons, they're shown in red here. And the ozone hole area is shown in blue. And they are anti-correlated. In other words, the fewer of these ozone depleters we emit, the greater the ozone hole becomes. And when this graph was first shown, I was at a mathematical seminar in Cambridge earlier this year, and I asked the supposed expert why this discrepancy, because he'd shown this graph without pointing out that, contrary to what he was saying, the less ozone depleters we use, the more you get an ozone hole. And he said, well, it's going to change. We predict that it will change. But it isn't. Not for 20 years. And here is that water vapor feedback. As you'll see, not all measures show this, but this is the International Satellite Cloud Climatology Project, and what it shows is a decline in water vapor at that vital 300 millibar level at the bottom there, and the rest are all stable. So now we get to red flags that are fraud, that actually are fraud. Here, for instance, is a fiddle by the IPCC in its 2007 fourth assessment report, by which they show the Hadley Centre's record of temperatures over the last 100 years and more. And you'll see those are shown in black and grey there. And then there are 4 trend lines superimposed. And the one that starts in 1850 is the shallowest. And then they all come to the present, but as they start more recently, the slopes increase. And they drew from this graph, which is an entirely bogus graph, the entirely invalid conclusion that the rate of global warming is accelerating and we are to blame. And here's why that's rubbish. Because there were 2 previous periods marked with the yellow arrows, just like the 3rd period, which had exactly the same rate of warming as that more recent period. So this was simply a lie. And this lie was picked up by, among others, the Royal Society, which in a paper congratulating the IPCC on spreading doom and alarm about the climate, showed this graph as an evidence of what wonderful work the IPCC was doing. So the entire scientific establishment has become corrupted by this. And when I showed this graph to a meeting of IPCC lead authors in Tasmania 3 years ago, one of them actually tried to say that it was perfectly appropriate to draw the conclusion they'd drawn from that graph. Well, you've only got to look at it to see that that is not the case. And I told him so. And I said, if you have nothing better to contribute than that, will you please leave? We are doing science here, not communist propaganda. And then the 1995 second assessment report, these huge multi-thousand pages, all written like the way I did the spade earlier. The pre-final draft, on 5 separate occasions, each of them printed here, said that we could not discern any human influence on global temperature or global climate. It simply couldn't be detected. Along comes Ben Santer, he of the fictional hotspot, and he rewrote it on behalf of the IPCC Secretariat that said we can't have the scientists saying there isn't a problem caused by us, because otherwise we're not going to be able to ponce around in Geneva claiming huge expenses and flying all over the world to places where they have grass skirts or sangria every year to have climate conferences. So they said, please will you sort this out? So Santer made 200 individual amendments to that final draft of the report, and those 200 amendments included the deletion of all 5 of these passages which had actually been the results found by the scientists, and he replaced them all with a single yellow, you see it backed in yellow there and in red letters, the body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on global climate. No, it didn't. No, it doesn't. But he was paid to make sure that the party line was upheld rather than the scientific truth. And there is a man who should be sacked, put on trial, and let's see whether the jury thinks that what he did to that report was honest or fair. What I can say is, as an expert reviewer, is that his amendments to that report were not sent to the expert reviewers for checking before the IPCC Secretariat simply published it. So if anyone thinks the IPCC is an honest or straight organization, you have now seen clear evidence of financial and scientific fraud. Here is another example. One of the sponsoring organizations of the IPCC is the World Meteorological Organization, based, like the IPCC itself, in Geneva. And if you try to report any of these organizations that make Geneva rich by headquartering themselves there, to the Bureau de l'Escroquerie, which is the fraud police in Switzerland, you will not even get the favor of a reply. So if you want to set up a real scam, a total fraud, like the World Meteorological Organization, as I'll show in a minute, and like the IPCC, then you can safely put it in Geneva and they will not lift a finger against you. The Bureau de l'Escroquerie is there to protect fraudsters. I wrote to them about the IPCC's bogus graph with the 4 trend lines on it. I said the conclusion they've drawn from this graph is improper. I've written to them and told them so. They have refused to correct it. The error is deliberate. Now go and lock them up. No reply. And here is the World Meteorological Organization, one of the 2 sponsoring bodies of the IPCC. And this is the graph they showed of 3 supposed reconstructions of temperature going back to the Middle Ages from tree rings. One in red by Jones et al., one in blue by Mann, and one at the bottom in green by Briffa. And look what they do in the 20th century. Isn't that scary? This was the first version of the hockey stick graph. It was the hokey stick graph. And it was first published on the front page, the front cover, of no less than the World Meteorological Organization's State of the Climate Report for 1999. Now, here is the truth. In that white panel, which, if you slide it across, would go over where this great increase comes, you'll see the black there on the white panel is the actual change in temperature measured by the thermometers around the world. But none of the tree ring data sets had any data in them that went above the dotted line about 2/3 up along there. So what they did was to splice on, without saying they'd done it, the actual temperature record, to change its color to make it look as though all three of the data sets were showing exactly what the temperature measured showed. And in fact, one of the three data sets, Briffa's, if you look in the middle of that white panel, actually shows a decline in temperatures after 1960, and they made it into a huge increase. And this graph was completely fraudulent, and eventually somebody took Michael Mann to court, and this graph came up. And he denied that he had anything to do with it, except that one of the three data sets is his, except that on the inside page of this document, he was acknowledged as one of the authors of this composite graph, and he tried to deny he'd had anything to do with it. So he too is a fraudster. He is corrupt. And I have said so publicly before, and I'm saying it again now. He cannot sue because he knows that what I am saying is true. So this is the difficulty they get themselves into when they tell lies. It eventually comes out. And I also wrote to the judge in his case saying, you may need to look at this. He has misled the court because he tried to lie to the court about it. Well, of course, in America, apparently you're allowed to do that. In Britain, he would have gone to jail. So here is the question whether the hockey stick graph is right. And what I've got is the original graph going back to the Middle Ages in the IPCC's first report. That's along the bottom there. Along the top, the changes in sea level reconstructed quite separately by Grinstead et al. A few years ago. And they kind of fit together rather well, as you would expect, because as it gets warmer, the sea level goes up, as it did in the Middle Ages. Then it gets cooler, a little ice age, sea level goes down, and now we're kind of halfway between the two. So those two graphs make sense. They're the same shape. They're doing much the same things. But then you try and put the sea level graph from Grinstead against the hokey stick graph, and the fit is a visibly bad fit. So we know the hokey stick graph is basically wrong because the sea level as reconstructed does not conform to it as it would have to if that graph was right. But perhaps the biggest fraud of the lot is the claim that there's a 97% consensus. This figure was cobbled together by a Nazi by the name of John Cook. I say Nazi because he is prone to wear Nazi uniforms. For the sake of good taste, I shall not be showing the rather ugly picture of him wearing his Nazi uniform. But he is a very extreme left-winger. He is not a scientist. But he wrote a paper published in one of the Enviro-Marxist journals, a very small and rather unconsidered journal, in which he defined the supposed consensus as the scientific consensus that human activity is very likely to be causing most of the current global warming or anthropogenic global warming. So first of all, you'll notice that in that consensus proposition, there is absolutely nothing about the climate being dangerously at risk. They have not dared to ask the scientists whether it's going to be dangerous or is dangerous, because they would get an answer, we don't know. So all they were willing to do a test of was with this rather milk and water consensus proposition, as they put it, that recent global warming of the last few decades was mostly man-made. And they said in the paper, and in subsequent papers and statements and articles and interviews, that their reading of these 11,944 papers published in the 21 years 1991 to 2011, that they'd read these papers and that 97.1% of them explicitly stated that most of the warming of recent decades was caused by us, or words to that effect. However, after they'd got 3 weeks of the most enormous international publicity in the fake media for this conclusion, and you'll still hear 97% consensus trotted out day after day after day by the left-wing news media and by politicians, I got hold of their data file in which they listed all 11,944 papers and in which they showed how they had marked them. And they had marked precisely 64 of them, or 0.5% of the sample, as explicitly stating that recent warming was mostly man-made. And when I then read those 64 papers, I found only 41 of those, or 0.3% of the entire sample, actually assented even to this milk and water consensus proposition. And they had reported that 0.3% consensus as though it were 97.1%. And the one way you can tell whether the mainstream media are going to be fair on this climate subject is whether any of them bothered to report the paper, the scientific paper, peer-reviewed and published, in which this conclusion was put into the literature by me and my colleagues David Leagates, Willie Soon and Matt Briggs. And that paper appeared only 6 months after theirs. And I have not yet seen it reported in any mainstream news medium. It's so much more convenient to them to be able to say over and over again there's a 97% consensus than to admit that actually they screwed up and it's only 0.3%. But 0.3%, ladies and gentlemen, is the accurate figure. So this is propaganda versus science. And in the end, whether they like it or not, science will prevail. Now, they then go on and say, we know how much the world will warm. This is the biggest lie, really. Here are the published predictions of what are called climate sensitivity. How much warming do you get per doubling of CO2 concentration? And they are declining. You get a few extreme examples that don't decline, but most of them are declining, steadily going down as they realize they cocked it up first time round. Here is another paper which shows that they were declining. And here is one of the reasons why they don't know what they're doing. It's because, as the IPCC eventually admitted in its third assessment report at paragraph 14.2.2.2, the climate is a complex, non-linear, chaotic object, and therefore the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. So let's disband the IPCC. And the image you saw there was the image of a chaotic object shown in graphical form. This is a tiny region of what is known as the Mandelbrot fractal projected onto the complex of Argand plane. And I discovered this particular region, and it is a remarkably pretty one. So they say the science is settled, and yet look at the huge range of their predictions. They have no idea how much warming there's going to be in the 21st century. All they will say is there's going to be somewhere between none and about 5 Celsius degrees. Well, I can assure you they'll be lucky to get even to 1 Celsius degree. They might get to 2, but it's pretty unlikely, and the rest is just made up. Now, we're going to look briefly at how they calculate global warming, and I will be testing you on this later, so please concentrate. Here is an equation, and this is, in fact, the fundamental equation of climate sensitivity. This is the one that they use. They take data out of the models on things like feedbacks and the CO2 forcing, and also the climate sensitivity parameter lambda 0. They put them all into this equation, and that tells them how much global warming they should be predicting. And you'll see it falls into 2 halves, the green half on the left, which is the direct warming from CO2, and then there's the feedback amplification factor, which is on the right there, which is in red. Now, if we look at the feedbacks just for a moment, they are shown for AR5, the 5th assessment report, in that tiny top right panel, yet again a postage stamp sized panel. But we have the technology. Let's turn it round so you can see it, and we'll enhance it and we'll enlarge it. And here is the value of feedbacks. And so we can get the range of their feedback estimates for AR5, that's the fifth assessment report, in red along the top of your screen there. And we feed that in to their equation together with the other values they give for the other inputs to that equation. And we get out, as you can see, results very similar to their own. The top two lines are us putting their data into that little equation of ours, and the bottom two lines are the published results for climate sensitivity using the same data. And you can see they're reasonably close to one another, which means we have understood that we can detect the way they calculate global warming because we've calibrated the equation by checking it produces the same results for us as it produces for them if we use their data. But now this is where it begins to get interesting, because I am now going to reveal a frank, substantial error of science, of physics, and of mathematics right at the heart of the process by which they diagnose from the models how much global warming will be likely to happen for a given change in concentration of CO2. They screwed up. This is a real error, and I'm going to show it to you now. And I began to realize this error must be there 10 years ago. I've been looking for it ever since, only found it a few weeks ago. And in this paper in 1938 from Guy Callender, who was the chief steam technologist for one of the alliances of British electrical and allied trades, he wrote this. He said that the climate is essentially thermostatic. Whenever you get a change in temperature, it tries to go back the other way and settle down again. Now, this is not well represented in the models, but it is well represented in the data. Here is a record going back 810,000 years. I think even Ed Griffin is too young to remember back that far. But what you have here is a variance either side of the period mean temperature of just 3.3 Celsius. It's very, very small variations. That's enough to give you ice ages at the bottom end and hothouse Earths at the top, and we're somewhere between the two, nearer the top than the bottom, actually. But still, it shows how very steady the temperature has been, notwithstanding the huge astronomical and other events that will have influenced the climate during that time. So what have they got wrong? Well, here is a curve. Does anybody know what kind of a curve this is? Exponential is not quite right. It's actually a hyperbola, and specifically a rectangular hyperbola. And this is the response curve of temperature to using that equation based on various estimates of what is called the feedback factor, the factor which allows for the amplification of the direct warming from CO2 by other processes in the atmosphere simply because the planet has warmed. And as you can see, their best estimates, and it's been like this since 1979, and we've had 5 subsequent IPCC reports, and they all more or less say the same. So again, why have we still got the IPCC? It has not advanced things since 1979, despite billions being spent. But here it is. They say between 1.5 and 4.5 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, central estimate 3 Celsius. But if you read the central estimate across to that graph and down to the feedback factor, you'll see it's jammed right up against the grey area there, which is the feedback range. What they should do is calculate it the other way, going from the central estimate of the feedback factor up to the graph and then reading across, and bingo, your 3 Celsius of warming that's been their central estimate, that comes down to 2.25 Celsius just because of that little mistake. But the bigger mistake comes in these outer bounds of the feedbacks, because as you'll see, the entire range of where they say climate sensitivity comes is in an area of that graph where the climate would be potentially unstable. And yet, as we've seen from the temperature records reconstructed for 800,000 years from the ice cores, it isn't unstable. So something was wrong. And I gave, again, when I showed this to the Tasmanians, to the IPCC lead authors, one of them who'd been sneering all the way through, suddenly said, he said, "Have you published this?" I said, "No, I'm still working on it. I still want to know what they're doing wrong." He said, "Well, you must publish it. This changes everything." A moment of honesty. He suddenly saw, oh my God, that doesn't look like how the climate really responds. And he'd never seen that graph before. It's quite a simple matter to calculate it, but he hadn't done it, he hadn't checked. But there it is. So, as you'll see, what is crucial is where on that hyperbola you do your feedback calculation. If you do it at the right-hand end where it's shooting up towards infinity, then a relatively small change in feedbacks along the bottom there will lead to a relatively large change, that big green slab, in temperatures of sort of 5 Celsius between the two estimates on the upper, the y-axis of the graph. Whereas if you do the calculation much more towards the origin of the graph on the left, then you'll see exactly the same change in the feedback estimates leads to a very, very narrow range in estimates of change of temperature. So I had the feeling that we should probably be doing the calculation more from the orange region than from the green region, but I couldn't prove it. I couldn't find out why, until an electronic engineer rings up 3 weeks ago and he says, they are doing it wrong. And he then told me that they were doing it wrong in a way which actually didn't make any difference. But he said, you must read the textbook. So I did. And the moment I read the textbook, Bode, 1945, that's the classic textbook on feedbacks in electronic circuits. The mathematics in there is of general application to dynamical systems such as the climate. I saw at once that here was the way it should be done. This is from Bode's book. You input your voltage or your temperature at T0 on the left, and the changed voltage, the final version, comes out as T on the right, after you have an amplifier mu, which is your radiative forcing, and then you have your feedback loop, which is measured by the feedback factor beta. That's how it should be done. And that's absolutely standard electronics. There are electronics engineers here, and they should howl out if I've got anything wrong, but it seems to me that that is how it's done. And we can then get the value of the gain factor, which is what you multiply the starting temperature with to get the finishing temperature, by this little equation here. I won't go through this now, but I'm showing it to you because those who are watching this on the internet will be able to check these mathematics for themselves and realize, if they are bedwetters, that with sinking hearts, that they no longer have anything to bedwet about. And here is the wrong way to handle feedback loops. You'll see the amplifier has gone. Why is that? Because they've also lost the actual starting temperature. And all you've got is the change in temperature, the delta as it's called, delta T0, the change in temperature as your input. There's no amplifier. And then there is the final change in temperature after feedbacks, which is the output. And you have a much bigger feedback factor than we would get if we did the calculation properly. Now, as you will see, in this example I've taken here, if you put in sort of 1.6 Kelvin and you allow for a feedback factor, which is their central estimate of about 0.485, as you've seen before, you get 2.25 Kelvin of warming at the other end. So now let's correct that and do it the right way. And here is how we convert from their feedback factor, which is F, to ours, which is beta. And again, I won't bother you with the details of that. It's there for those who are looking in. And then you will see, to your amazement, that by doing it correctly, we get precisely the same answer. And that is why this mistake has never been spotted before. Because your electronic engineer knows the value of feedbacks. There's no uncertainty in that value. He can put any resistor he likes in that circuit and tune it to give a particular feedback. So he can do the calculation at one point on that curve, and he can then calculate from that what the answer will be, and he can do it either by putting the delta in and the delta out, or the absolute temperature in and the absolute temperature out. It doesn't matter. It gives you the same answer. And that's why the electronic engineer who'd first told me to read the textbook said, oh, no, that's not an error. But actually, yes, it is. Because you see, what you have to do is to look at the variances in the feedbacks when you don't know what the feedback value is. And therefore, you might say, well, it could be 40% more or it could be 40% less. And that will cover 95% of all possibilities. In other words, it's what's called the 2 sigma or 2 standard deviation margins either side of the central estimate. And so once you know that it's 40%, it's got to be 40% whether you use their feedback factor F or our feedback factor beta. But if you use our feedback factor beta and calculate it from that, suddenly you can see a difference between what they predict, which is 1.5 to 4.5 Celsius, and we will now make that 1.8 to 2.7 Celsius. 2.7, well below the 4.5 that they thought. So yes, you'll still get some warming, but we have now achieved what climate science has been trying to achieve for 40 years, which is to constrain the interval of climate sensitivity and narrow it down from that huge 1.5 Celsius either side of the central estimate to less than half a Celsius either side of the central estimate. And as you can see, the difference between our version and theirs is that we predict an upper bound of climate sensitivity, assuming you start with their feedback factor, 1.8 Celsius less than theirs. So it's a very, very big difference. And if we look at this graphically, and you can see it here, this time applied to the AR5, the fifth assessment report sensitivities, the grey area is the zone in which we say there might be temperature change, climate sensitivity. The black thick line is common to both methods because we're simply accepting the central estimate amended as we amended it earlier. And then look at the current method, particularly if your central estimate of feedback is towards the right-hand end of the graph. They predict suddenly enormous amounts of warming, which in reality we now know will not happen. What this means is the argument that there will be tipping points disappears. All this stuff about how we might be getting to a tipping point and suddenly the climate will go into overdrive and we'll get a hothouse Earth and all the ice will melt and the seas will rise and all sorts of left-wing states like California will be washed into the sea. Hang on a moment, I think we want more of this global warming. But, ladies and gentlemen, the point is that as you can see from that graph again, the difference between the true position and the much more exaggerated position that they go for is very large, just as a result of this one error. So if we look at the comparison directly, there it is, but there's more, or rather there's less, because Will Happer, who spoke to you in such a distinguished way this morning, and I hope that he will be having a good input into the new administration, they should certainly listen to him. Am I not right, ladies and gentlemen? A formidable physicist, a very likable man. He's been kind to me on many occasions, helped me out on many of my climate projects. It would be lovely to think that he is now going to be listened to as he should have been all along. So he has shown these equations, which are partial differential equations, to do with the line shapes, modeling the excitation, de-excitation collisions between the photons of radiation in the near infrared and the bending vibrational mode of the CO2 molecule. Are you as baffled as I am by all that? Good. So I'm not going to test you on these equations because they are in fact very difficult and quite difficult to solve. But these equations assume that the excitation and de-excitation collisions are instantaneous. They happen at the same time at once. Bang, it happens. In fact, there is a delay of 1.6 picoseconds, which is very small. It's shorter even than the length of this speech. And the effect of that is, according to Will Happer, in a distinguished paper he gave to the meeting on planetary emergencies of the World Federation of Scientists in Sicily this time last year, he said that in fact this meant that they were overstating that central estimate of climate sensitivity by 40%. A very big error this time in the central estimate. And if we put you can see now the variance in the line shapes, one in grey and one in black, between the two methods, one where you correct for this instantaneous collision and one where you don't. And so here is Happer now, he's the third line on there, and you'll see that if he brings down the sensitivity, if we assume it was 2.25 Celsius before, that in fact should come down to 1.6, and on our chart that means it comes out to just 0.3 Celsius either side of the central estimate. That's 1/5 of the variances that they predict. And you can see we get, even on the high end, less than 2 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2. And that will take hundreds of years to arise. And the bottom line is that there are many other papers that are now increasingly saying that climate sensitivity is very low. There's Herman Harder, H there, in 2016, a paper just out, based on, again, a detailed line-by-line radiative transfer calculation. Then there is Lindzen and Choi. You'll all know Dick Lindzen, perhaps the most formidable atmospheric physicist that's ever lived, now sadly largely retired, though one still hears from him from time to time. But he also said 0.7 Kelvin, and he used the measurements of the Earth Radiation Budget Experiment satellite to show that that was the case. And then there is Spencer and Braswell, 2011. That's the S there. He came to exactly the same answer, but this time by looking at the cloud feedback and finding it negative when the IPCC pretends it's positive. All of these, by three completely distinct methods, came to the same low answer. And if you then apply my correction to their method, you see that you're then down to just probably less than 0.1 Celsius, either side of the central estimate of 0.7 Celsius, and in that case, looking at 4/5 of a Celsius degree per doubling of CO2. That is probably more likely to be true than the IPCC's 4.5 Celsius. So this is the bottom line, and as you can see, what we've essentially done is to wipe out the climate problem. It's gone. Now, I was going to do a little segment on climate economics, but I will not do that. I think I've tested your patience enough. What I will do is end by saying something which I think is very important. It must be very clear to all of you that there is a moral dimension to this. You have seen the sheer scale and brazenness of the frauds that they have perpetrated. You have seen the sheer massiveness of the discrepancy between what they've predicted and what is happening to global temperature. You have now seen also that they have made a series of scientific errors in working out how much global warming we're going to get. And it is those errors that provide the sole basis for alarm about the climate. Take away the errors and the climate scare disappears. So I am now in a position to declare the climate scare to be over. I do not think they're going to go quietly into that last good night. I think there's going to be a lot of snapping and snarling and whining and excuses before they finally accept that the science is in, the truth is out, the game is up, and the scare is over. To help them along their way, I want them to remember this, that at the moment, 1.2 billion of our fellow citizens of this planet have no electrical power. They can't have a meeting like this at night because there's no light, and they can't have it during the day because there's no amplification. They can't read at night, they can't study at home, they can't cook or keep themselves warm except by burning dung or timber on fires with no chimneys, so that 2 million a year die from one of the many causes of death from not having electricity, which is the particulate pollution from smoke inside their huts, which would be done away with altogether if they were given even a little electricity. So why, in that case, is the international community saying that we might have a few thousand deaths 100 years from now because of global warming, when every month 1 million people are dying because they and the international community, instead of giving cheap, reliable, baseload coal-fired electricity that they can maintain in the way that they couldn't maintain even gas-fired, let alone nuclear or these stupid windmills or solar panels. They need baseload coal-fired power. China is, of course, doing that. India is doing that. Mr. Modi has said he's not having any more nonsense, people telling him he can't lift his people out of poverty. China is saying the same. And because they're saying that, CO2 emissions are going to rise. So why don't we face the fact that what the international community should be doing at these annual conferences is reporting back the progress on their using a tiny fraction of the money they're now squandering on making non-existent global warming go away, and spend that tiny fraction instead on giving everyone in the world electrical power. It is a holocaust every 6 months that they are directly responsible for causing, because they will not allow these countries to have this electricity. They preach and lecture and bully them at these international conferences to tell them it's better to keep their people poor and watch them die than to give them electricity. That is how far from stark reality the international governing class has now departed. It is a flagrant, unchristian abuse of the power we are given to help our fellow men. We are wealthy enough to lift them all out of poverty, to give them electricity. Once they've got electricity, you can then give them a decent water supply because you've got pumps to drive the water. You can have a decent sewerage system because you've got pumps to drive that. Once you've got electricity, their life expectancy will very greatly increase. You can then store medicines and thereby get rid of most of their infectious diseases, the big killers in third world countries. You could transform their lives by giving them electricity. But what about the carbon footprint? Well, thanks to the detection of the errors that I've shown to you today, we no longer have to worry about that at all. What about the consumption of resources and the wider environmental footprint of a greater population? Well, the great thing is, it's one of the best kept secrets of the demographers, that the greater the rate of prosperity of a nation, the more quickly the rate of increase in its population tends towards replacement level, tends towards stability. If you really want to reduce the footprint of man on this planet, then universal prosperity is the only way to achieve that. And the major obstacle to that universal prosperity is the global warming scare. And that is why I have worked so hard for 10 years to find this error, report it. We're hoping to get it published shortly in a learned journal. Once it's there, then as far as the science is concerned, the game is up. That's it. It's all over. So where does this leave us, lovers of freedom? At last, the reality, the scientific truth, is beginning to emerge from amid the frauds and the lies and the broadcasts from the Marxist media, the fake media. At last, people are beginning to realize that we have a greater obligation to those who are dying now than to those who are speculatively going to die 100 years hence. There's a growing realization that in any case, the loss of freedom entailed by the global government, which the United Nations admitted in the incautious Copenhagen draft it wished to establish in the name of saving the planet from non-existent global warming, that global government would be far more dangerous to all life on Earth than any amount of coal-fired power stations. We reject the bogus science of global warming and the bogus economics and the lies and the frauds. We will not be silenced, however often they trash our reputations or threaten us with imprisonment or psychiatric prison or even execution. We will continue to speak the truth because we want our fellow men to live and not to die, and we want them and us to live free. Let freedom ring.